Welcome everyone to another exciting episode of the Return to Zion. And tonight we're going to be talking about the role of Gentiles in what is the status of Gentiles? What are the issues with Gentiles? It's actually, we're not going to be talking about all the aspects, because of course that we have talked already in terms of building the walls of Jerusalem, the issues that there were threats from members and representatives of the surrounding nations. We've already discussed that. We're going to be talking more conceptually and in terms of foreign wives. Foreign wives, as you know, becomes a very big issue during this period. Now, let's do a bit of a retrospective in terms of the issue of foreign wives. Okay, now for throughout in the biblical stories, right, in Genesis, certainly there is I don't know if I would call it a free for all, but certainly you have, from the time that you're talking about, like, let's say Jacob's sons, certainly they are taking foreign wives, right? So Yehuda is married to a Canaanite woman, and that's not considered a big deal. Joseph can marry an Egyptian woman. That's not considered a big deal. They are where they are, and they are marrying from where they are. Now, of course, in the very first generations, right, if we're talking about Yitzchak and Yaakov, Isaac and Jacob, it's very important that they marry from the family. But afterwards, it seems to be a less of an issue, at least in terms of the stories. But once you have the people of Israel, there is an expectation. There's also a commandment that they not take foreign wives. Which wives are they not supposed to take? They're not supposed to take foreign wives in the nations of the land that they are going to. In the land of Canaan, they are not supposed to marry women of the local nations, because that will cause them to do idol worship. You also have certain issues where there's kind of an issue of, let's say, Egyptians, children of mixed marriages. One of the person who curses God, for example, and is killed, essentially is executed for cursing God, is a child of a mixed marriage in the desert. And then what we see in the first temple period, we don't see it addressed as an issue so much, except when we talk about kings. Kings, of course, the more successful king, the more likely he is to take a foreign wife, because he's going to need it for his alliances. So he's going to take a foreign wife for his alliances, and that, for example, with Shlomo HaMelech, with Solomon, that causes him to sin, and not just him. We see that's recounted as an issue, and we'll see it in our text here. Once we get to the Second Temple period, this becomes a major issue for two reasons. Let's say, starting with two reasons. One is that the Torah is more widely accepted and codified. People understand that Torah law is what they're supposed to be keeping. And they're much more likely to have come into contact with foreign nations and therefore have taken foreign wives. So if you're talking about the First Temple period, I'm not talking about when you're living during the First Temple period. Yes, people on the edges are going to meet with perhaps women from other areas. Shimshon, right, famously, he has a thing for Philistine women, right? He likes Philistine women. He's always getting in trouble with Plishti women, and that's his thing, because he lives in an area where there are a lot of Plishtim, of Philistines. But in general, if you're living within the land, you're mainly going to meet other Israelites or other Judahites, and so it's going to be less of an issue. And at the same time, there's less of an idea that it's necessarily disastrous to marry a foreign wife, right? There's an idea that, okay, you might take a foreign wife, and we have this in the Torah as well. If you meet a woman, you're going out to battle, and you take a woman essentially in battle, she's either a camp hanger on, or you've actually taken her from the enemy, the idea is that she's going to join the nation, essentially. You have to treat her as a human being. You have to let her mourn her parents. You can't just take her as some kind of slave or mistress against her will. However, the idea is that then if you don't like her, you can't just cast her off. The idea is that you have responsibility for her, but the idea is also that she's joining the nation. That's not going to be a problem for the nation as a whole. Once we get to the Second Temple period, this is no longer true. And in terms of at least some of our of what who we're going to read today, we actually, even when we talk, and we're going to talk about Yeshayahu, second Isaiah, which has a much more inclusive view of Gentiles in general. However, he doesn't talk about mixed marriage, right? That's just not an issue for him. He's speaking in an idealized period where that's not even a thing. Why is it not a thing? We can discuss it. But essentially, there is a problem of mixed marriages. And this is something that both Ezra and Nehemiah want to tackle and do tackle in different ways. We're also going to see kind of the emotional aspect of it, the painful aspect of it in the text that we are going to read in Malachi. So let's jump in first. Actually, let's jump in with actually, you know what? Why don't we start with Malachi, because people are less familiar with this text, and it kind of gives us an emotional kind of background for what is going on. Any questions before I start? Oh, Moshe's saying when Esav married Hittite women, one of who interestingly was named Yehudit, this is said to cause morat ruach, bitterness of spirit, to Yitzchak and Rivka. Yes, that is true. I think especially Rivka, I believe, right? But yes, the idea that Esav married women who are foreign. Notice that Hittite women are very foreign. So who does he marry then to make it up to them? He marries children from Ishmael, right? Because Ishmael is in that same line as in the Abrahamic line, and that's how Esau kind of fixes it, right? So you do have this idea that there's certain types of foreign women that you don't want people to marry. And I see Charlotte just a second, but it's still true that once we get past Asaph, once we get past Yaakov and that generation, it doesn't seem to be it's not presented as a problem. Yes, in the Midrash, they're marrying their Jewish sisters, but in the text, in the plain meaning of the text, they are marrying women from who are there. Yes, Cheryl.
So I was just thinking when you said that it upset Rivka more than Yaakov, that because Abraham had taken a wife for Yitzchak from his family, right? That perhaps Rivka had been thinking all along that her sons would be taking brides from that family also, and she would be upset that her family was not being included in Esav's choices. That it was more a family thing.
It could be. There absolutely is this idea when we talk about the Avot patriarchs that there's an idea of marrying from that family. In other words, that to send that, the whole idea is I'm sending you to marry from that family because we still need to marry from family, and we should be marrying essentially cousins, and that's the idea that we're supposed to do it. And that for some reason that just kind of falls apart when we get to the children of Yaakov, and one assumes just because there are too many of them, they're too far away, they're moving back and forth, it's no longer something that you can do, or simply that at this point, once we have the children of Yaakov, it's based enough that we don't have to make sure that keep marrying cousins and keeping it in the family. It's interesting because Rivka, on the one hand, why is it bothering? So she didn't seem to care that much about Esav before, and now she's being bothered by Esav. And it's also another situation of Esav trying desperately to please his parents and not having a clue. It's that kind of painful. It's hard to be Esav. Like, it's not fun being Esav, let's face it. When he wants his parents to like him, and he misses sometimes. It's part of that whole aspect of the story, I think, to me. But I don't want to get too far off track, so let's bring it back. Let's dive into, unless someone has anything else to say, let's dive into Malachi. Now, again, when we talk about Malachi, we don't know exactly when Malachi is from. We know that he's speaking when there is a functioning temple, right? There's a functioning Beit HaMikdash, and so he's not in those first generations like Haggai and Zechariah are. Malachi has a style, which actually is this right? Yes. Malachi has a style which is kind of to have these rhetorical questions and these kind of back and forth where the nation is saying, God is saying something, the nation's answering back. That is the way most interpreters interpret what we're going to read now, that it's Israel is speaking in the first pasuk. The people of Israel, the people of Judah are speaking. They say, "Halo av echad lechulanu, halo el echad bra'anu, madua nivgad ish b'achiv lechalel brit avotenu." So all have one Father. We all have one God created us. Why should we betray? Each person should betray his brother to desecrate the covenant of our forefathers. And they're talking in terms of there's this kind of universal covenant. God created all of us. Why should we betray that covenant? What would that mean? Okay, so it's they're talking about marrying foreign wives. Okay, they're talking about why would we not marry Gentile wives? After all, one God created us. Isn't there some kind of covenant joining all of us? So he says, Bagda Yehuda v'toeva nesta b'Yisrael u'v'Yerushalayim ki chilel Yehuda kodesh Adonai asher ahev uva'al bat el nechar. He says, no, on the contrary. You say, oh, we don't want to betray our brothers. No, Judah has in fact betrayed, and they've done an abhorrent thing in Israel and in Jerusalem, because Judah has desecrated, not some kind of fictional covenant that you're making up. They've actually desecrated the holiness of God, that God essentially loved Israel. Okay, so in other words, you, Israel, you, Judah, have a certain status, and that has to do with your relationship with God, and you have betrayed it. Uva'al bat el nechar, and you have married, have kind of coupled up with the daughter of an alien god. So this is, in fact, this is what does it do when you take a foreign wife, when you take a Gentile wife, is you are betraying the holiness that God has imbued in you. Yachret Adonai la'ish asher yasena ve'oneh me'olei Yaakov umagish mincha l'Adonai tzvaot. So what is the punishment going to be? That God is essentially going to cut off your descendants from the tents of Yaakov, in other words, from the nation, and from the priesthood. You're not going to be able to bring a mincha to God, to bring a sacrifice to God, an offering to God. V'zot sheni tasu. What is the other aspect that you are doing when you're taking these Gentile wives? What have they been doing? We'll find out. V'zot sheni tasu. Kasot dim'a et mizbach Adonai b'chi v'anaka me'en od pnot el hamincha v'lakachat ratzon miyedchem. What else have you done? You are covering the altar of God with tears and wailing and crying, so that God will no longer listen to your offerings. He's no longer going to desire what you give him. V'amaltem alma, and you say, why? Ki Hashem he'id bencha uven eshet neurecha asher ata bagadeta ba v'hi chavertecha ve'eshet britecha. Because what have you done? You had the wife of your youth, your high school girlfriend, right? The girl next door who you married. In other words, the Israelite Jewish girl next door you married. And what are you doing now? You are betraying her and taking a Gentile wife. In other words, they had Jewish wives, but they're also taking Gentile wives, and as such, they are breaking their covenant, essentially their faith, with the wives of their youth. V'lo echad asa u'sh'ar ruach lo u'ma ha'echad mevakesh zera Elohim v'nishmartem b'ruchachem u've'eshet nu'urecha al yivgod. Right? So what is God? God made you, and what does God want? He wants you to have godly seed and to remain true in spirit and do not betray the wife of your youth. So here we see a whole different aspect of this. Not that, oh, you're taking foreign wives, you're betraying your current wives. You had a wife in your youth and you're betraying her by doing this. Ki saneh shalach, amar Adonai Elohei Yisrael, v'chisach hamas al levusho, amar Adonai Tzvaot, v'nishmartem beruchachem v'lo tivgodu. What does God hate? God hates that you are divorcing your wives and that you're betraying your wives and that you're covering yourself with I actually like the translation lawlessness here. You're dressing yourself in lawlessness by divorcing the wives of your youth, and rather you should guard your spirit and not betray these women. So here we have all the different aspects that we could imagine in terms of what it means that they're taking foreign wives. They are taking foreign wives. This is considered a betrayal of the covenant with God in which Israel is special, and you're not supposed to marry out, as it were. And they're also betraying their existing wives. They have wives, and they're taking other wives who are foreign wives, and in that they are creating a betrayal that disgusts and horrifies God, and that is like weeping on the altar itself.
Whose tears are on the altar? Is that God's
Excellent
tears?
question.
Is that the women's
Excellent
tears?
question. I think it's the women's tears. I think that the tears, the women's tears. You could also read it as it. I wouldn't say it's God's tears because God doesn't cry that way. But you could also say it's like metaphorical tears, like not necessarily the women's tears, but metaphorical tears because of the sorrow you're creating in the world. So you are creating tears on the altar of God. But I do feel like the weeping, the bechiva anaka, I do think is supposed to be connected to the first wives. That it's the weeping of the women.
So there doesn't seem to be an issue here of people just marrying out. This is people who are getting rid of their first wives.
It's both. They're divorcing the first wives and they're taking foreign wives. Now realize that the first aspect of it, the thing that he talked about first, was the idea that you're marrying out, was the idea that you're supposed to be holy to God and yet you're doing this thing, right? But the thing, the emotional weight, it is true. The emotional weight in this passage is absolutely on the idea that they're divorcing their first wives and taking the foreign wives.
But the text
Right.
doesn't
And
even say that. You don't know that that at this time, bigamy is still allowed. So how do we know that the first wife isn't staying in the picture?
It's saying, I'll show you the word that we're basing ourselves on. It says, kisane shalach. That is on the basis of that. That is the source to say that it's talking about divorce, that God hates shalach l'shaleach. So it sounds like it's talking about divorcing. It also sounds like it doesn't have to be, that even if they don't divorce, it's still a betrayal of the first wife, right? Bigamy's allowed. I always say that if you read the stories of Breshit, of Genesis, the idea you come out of it with is, yes, you're allowed to do this, but it is a bad idea. And some of the people who suffer in this setup are the wives. I don't know anyone who can read the story of Rachel and Leah, of Rachel and Leah, and not feel that, you know what? This is not great for the wives. The wives are not happy in this arrangement, right? And in fact, taking a second wife is not in this retelling. It's not all hunky dory for the first wife. Now, bigamy may be allowed, but they're not allowed to take this. But so there's these two aspects of it. Bigamy is allowed. You're causing pain to your first wife, but what isn't allowed is bigamy with a foreign wife. So it's not allowed. You're doing something that's not allowed, and you're causing pain to your first wife, and it sounds like they're divorcing her. Why divorce her? Because they've got a wife. In other words, that you divorce her, you're not supporting her anymore, and now you have the wife that you're supporting. right? So it's absolutely possible that they were divorcing the first wife, even if bigamy is allowed, because bigamy is an expensive prospect. It's not easy. Is there another question?
Yeah, Danny has something to say. Go ahead.
It always meant כי שונא שלח, זהו ששונא אשתו, נתן לו גט.
So that's what she's saying. It's
You
again.
think that? They hear, oh. Is
I
that
see.
what-
I see what you're saying. I do think you could read it that way. Ki saneh shalach amar Hashem Elokei Yisrael v'chisach hamas al levusho. Because he hated and divorced, and that caused this Hamas, this violence, to clothe himself in violence. By divorcing his wife, he clothes himself in violence. So
Okay,
that's
thank you.
another way of reading it, as opposed to God hating divorce. If he despised and divorced, and the person who did this, and thereby clothed himself in violence and lawlessness. So thank you for that. And so at any rate, it seems that we're talking about both the religious aspect, quote unquote, and the emotional aspect. What are they doing to their wives? Right. And again, that emotional aspect in Malachi has absolutely what we'd say today, absolute religious meaning. In other words, God is not going to accept your sacrifices because you've done this to your wife. It's very clear. You've done this to your wife. The fact that you've done this to your wife has caused tears on the altar, on the Mizbeach, and God will not accept your sacrifices because of what you've done, because of the pain you have caused and the treachery against the wife of your youth. Now let's move away from this from looking at it emotionally. I mean, there's still an emotional aspect. And let's look at the moves that Ezra and Nehemiah make in terms of these foreign wives. Let's take a look. And with Ezra, we're going to just, because we did a lot of this last week, we're going to do it relatively quickly. Okay. So I'll just remind you of what we talked about last week. Yes. So if you recall, Ezra was very upset when he realized that there are these, when he realizes about everyone marrying foreign women. Okay. And he says, oh, we've only been given this short time that we actually were able to return to the land of Israel, to Judea, to rebuild our temple. And now everything is at risk once again, right? And Ezra, as opposed to Malachi does not quote a biblical verse to say this is why you can't take foreign wives, but Ezra does. Ezra refers to biblical ideas and the biblical nations, right? That you should not be marrying, right? And this is what you are doing. You are causing impurity, essentially, of the land. Of the land and of your seed. By intermarrying with these nations of abominations, right? You are going to cause us to be completely destroyed. And everyone listens. They actually say, oh, wow, we really are in a lot of trouble. And they all say, we are going to separate from our foreign wives. And there are so many of them that they essentially assign officials who are going to be in charge of this, and they will all expel their foreign wives. Okay, we're in Ezra, Tet, and Yud, so Ezra 9 and 10. Now we're flipping through 10, okay? So, and you have Yamdu Nasareno L'chol Kahal B'chol Asher Ba'arenu Haushiv Nashim Nochriot Yavo Litim Mizumanim, right? They all have to anyone who took with them foreign women, they will come at appointed times. So everyone who's intermarried is coming at scheduled times so that they make sure that you're sending out, you're expelling the foreign wives, right? And essentially they take all the names, they sit on it from the 1st of the 10th month, and they are done by the 1st of the 1st. In other words, it takes them probably 3 months. And by the first, Vayichalu Akol Bakol Anashim Haushivu Nashim Nochriot Ad Yom Echad LaChodesh Harishon. So by the 1st of Nisan, they are done with all the people, all the men who had brought with them foreign women or brought foreign women into their homes. And it actually, and among them are Kohanim, are the priests. ומצא מבני הכהנים אשר הושיבו נשים נוכריות מבני ישוע בן יהוצדק ואחיו, Maaseiah ואליעזר והריב וגדליה. So these are actually from the sons of Yoshua ben Yotzadok, right? So from the high priest family, you actually have people who have married foreign women of the Kohanim, of the priests. And they all say, yes, we are going to expel our wives and in fact bring a sacrifice. And they have the lists of all the people who needed to expel their wives. These are from the Kohanim, from the priests, from the Leviim, from the Levites, Minhag Mishorarim, from the singers, which was also a special class, right? And then from Yisrael, right? And from Elam, from Zatu, for all these different groups. And from these different families, you have this list of people who had foreign wives. You have the list of people who had foreign wives, and they all need to expel them. And it says, Kol ele nas'u nashim nachriot, v'yesh mehem nashim vayasimu banim. And there, besides the women, there are some of the women that they had children with. Okay? And one assumes they were all expelled. And one assumes also the reason we need to hear this list, or the reason they're keeping this list, is so you know, hey, there were children from these also, and these children aren't part of. Remember, this is when they start getting very strict in terms of genealogical trees. So this is when people start caring about who are you descended. And it's not when they start, but in terms of everyone caring, right? How do you trace yourself? So they're like, hey, these people, some of them actually had children. And the assumption is that also the children also are going to be expelled. Now we see in Nehemiah, there is a similar issue. I'm going to pause here because I see there's some things in the chat. Okay. All right. So Tractate Gittin says that the altar cries when a man divorces his first wife. Yes, and that is from, of course, this verse. I'll share my screen so everyone can see it. Let's see. Can everyone see the quote? Okay. Da'amar Rabbi Elazar, kol ha'megaresh ishto rishona, afilo mizbeach morid alav dma'ot, shene'emar, זאת שנית תעשו כסות דמעת מזבח השם, וכי בנקה מאין עוד פנות על מנחה, ולקחת אותו מידכם. Right, and this is just essentially, it just quotes the whole thing, right? So Rabbi Elazar says, everyone who divorces his first wife, even the altar cries about it, and that's from this verse. And I do think that meaning is there. The meaning is there that divorcing one's first wife causes a metaphysical sorrow.
Unless she's not Jewish.
The assumption here, so what's interesting here is that the situation that Malachi is describing is one where your childhood sweetheart is Jewish. In other words, the person that you married first was Jewish, and then at a certain point in your life, you took on a foreign wife, right? And this actually makes a certain amount of sense if you say, well, as an adult, you start mixing more with outside of your family, right? So when you're young, and then one assumes that they would get married really quite young, you're still within your community. And who are you going to meet? You're going to meet with someone in your community. Then when you're older, you start doing business, you start going out, you start meeting, and you start being in a situation where you can marry a foreign woman, also because you have money, right? So you can do those deals that you need to do in order to obtain a foreign wife in the ancient world, and a second wife. Let's face it, a second wife. Note that, of course, with what we just read in Ezra, there's no mention of first wives there. That's not the issue. The issue is taking a foreign wife to begin with, at any point. So Yaffa says,
there's no sympathy at all for the foreign wives.
That's right. That is correct. That is correct. A distinct lack of sympathy for the foreign wives, especially if they have children. I mean, you've got to feed their children there. Yaffa says, are these foreign wives and kids provided for in some way, or are they out in the cold? We don't know. We don't know what happens to these women and their children. And Sarah says, no mention of alimony or child support, not even a jug of water, as with Hagar. Cruel. It seems quite. Now, I would like to think that there were, after all, they're doing it all very bureaucratically. So I would like to hope that the part of them doing it so bureaucratically is so that you don't have a bunch of women wandering around without food. In other words, that they're doing this in a very orderly way so that these women are taken care of. In other words, so that they do, let's say, bring them back to their families. They do, because otherwise, why not just say, if you really didn't care, you can say, okay, just everyone expel your wives. Why do you need to make a list? Why do people need appointments? Why does this need to be done in such an orderly way? So my hope is the reason it's being done in an orderly way is so that things are taken care of in an orderly way. And these women are, let's say, brought back to their home, or it's arranged that they're going to be taken back to their home, or doing something so that they're taken care of. That's my hope. Of course, the jug of water with Hagar, it's interesting that, Hagar gets food in a jug of water. Well, one would certainly hope so, because she's being sent out in the desert. And by the way, that's why the text with Hagar tells us that she got lost, because that's how she runs out of water. In other words, we should know that Abram gave her enough water to get home, but she got lost, and so she ran out of water. If you've ever gone hiking in the, in Midbar Yehuda or any place like that, you know how important it is to not get lost.
So, Miriam,
Yeah,
why
yes.
is if the Torah says that you take this foreign woman that you take in battle and you make her part of the community, why isn't there an attempt? Why isn't there any attempt at conversion or of changing
Right. So
of like
this is always the question.
legitimizing this? Okay.
Right. So there seems to be here a general idea that these women can't be legitimized, right? That there also seems, let's jump into Nehemiah, because Nehemiah addresses this to a certain extent. The way Nehemiah talks about it can kind of bring us a little bit of insight here. There are some other pieces of Nehemiah that I am going to read, but I want to jump to this because of your question. Gam b'yamim hahem, it's the assumption seems to be it's when Nehemiah, the implication rather. Yes, so we're in Nehemiah Yud Gimel, that's Nehemiah 13. We're reading from Pasuk Chaf Gimel, verse 23. So it's implied that this is happening when Nehemiah returns for his second period of rule. He goes back, he's called back to the king, and then he returns. He says, Gam bayamim hahem ra'iti et haYehudim hoshivu nashim ashdodiot, Ammoniot, Moaviyot. He says, also in those days, I see that the Jews had married women, Ashdodi women, Ammonite women, and Moabite women. Uvneihem chatzim medaber Ashdodit, ve'inam makirim ledaber Yehudit, v'chilshon am va'am. And their sons, their children, half of them were speaking Ashdodi. They didn't even know how to speak Jewish, right? So they're speaking some kind of Philistine, Canaanite mix, whatever they're speaking in the area on the coast, and they're not speaking Hebrew. They're each one is speaking according to the language of their nation. Whose nation? Their mother's nation. In other words, they haven't assimilated to us. They are foreign children, right? That seems to be the issue for Nehemiah, besides the fact that, of course, there are Ammoni and Moavi women, that there are specific commandments, not necessarily talking about the women. It's talking about a man, an Ammoni, a Moavi man can't join the community. But his issue seems to be much less in this passage. In this passage is less the idea that, okay, they're married. It's like there is a deterioration here. They are, in fact, not converting. They're not assimilating to us. Va'ariv imam va'kalim va'kemehem anashim v'matem. He does a bunch of things. He curses them. He hits them. He tears out their hair. Va'ashbiyem belohim im titnu b'notechem livneihem v'imtisu b'notechem livneichem v'lachem. Here he quotes the biblical verse. He says, and I had them swear by God, if you should give your daughters to their sons, and if you should take from their daughters to your sons and to you, right? You're not allowed to do this. There's a biblical verse that says you're not allowed to do this. And then he continues, Halo al elech Shlomo melech Yisrael, uvagoyim harabim lo haya melech kamohu, v'ahuv lelo havaya. Vayitnehu Elohim melech hakol Yisrael, gam oto hechtiu hanashim anochriot. What is the problem? He says Shlomo King Solomon, Shlomo HaMelech sinned in this way, right? There was no king like him among all the nations. He was beloved by God. So that sounds all great, right? And God made him king over Israel. But even he was made to sin by having foreign wives. So what is the point here? The point is that Nehemiah is saying that it's not just that, oh, Shlomo HaMelech is a bad king because he took foreign wives. He was made to sin because he took foreign wives. In other words, he took foreign wives and he was not immune. And that's what I'm seeing with you, he says. V'lachem hanishma lasot et kol hara'ah hagdola hazot lim'ol be'Eloheinu lo shiv nashim nochriot. He said, and so how can we do the same great evil to rebel against our God and to marry foreign women? And one of the people, in fact, says to someone, you can no longer be a Kohen, a priest, Ubnei Yoyada ben Eliashiv HaKohen HaGadol, Chatan l'Sanballat HaChoroni, Vavrichehu me'alai. He expels someone who is the son of Eliashiv, the high priest, or of the sons, I should say. One of the sons of Yoyada, the son of Eliashiv, the high priest, who was a son-in-law to Sanballat the Choroni. In other words, he took a foreign woman, and Nehemiah expels them. Zochra lahem Elohai al go'olei hakehuna uvrit hakehuna v'leviim. So remember, God, that they have defiled the priesthood, the covenant of the priests and the Levites. V'tiharti michol nechar v'amida mishmerot l'kohanim v'leviim ish b'malato. And I purify them from all foreign people. And the pay means that there's a space there. So even though it's the same verse, it's a new passage saying that I set up shifts for the priests and the Levites, so that it's a new topic. So that's kind of like the place where we have this being addressed most centrally in Nehemiah. We also have it, and we're going to look at this in a different context. We have the covenant in Nehemiah 10. I'm going to flip to the end here, right, where everyone agrees. Vasher lo niten bnotenu la'amei ha'aretz v'bnotehem lo nikach levanenu. We won't intermarry. This is right before their promise to not buy and sell on Shabbat. But this Nehemiah 10 is actually something that it's a covenant that is not. We're going to discuss it separately because it seems to be something that stands on its own. And here, in the beginning of Parak Yud Gimel of chapter 13 in Nehemiah, it talks about some random time when they read the Torah. We have zero context for this. It says, Bayom Hahu, on that day, and we don't know what day, Nikra Sefer Moshe Boznei Ha'am, V'nimtza Katuv Bo, Asher Lo Yavo Amoni Umoavi B'kal Elohim Ad Olam. Okay? We read the Torah, and once again, here's a verse that we didn't remember, that you're not allowed to bring an Ammoni or Moavi into the congregation of God. Because they didn't give Israel bread and water when they came through, and they hired Bilam to curse them. And when they heard the words of the Torah, they all separated, right? All the mixed, whoever separated from Israel. And it sounds like it's also talking about offspring, okay? This seems a little bit easy compared to what we read in other places. It's hard to believe it was quite that simple, but this is a place where, okay, they heard it and they're like, oh yeah, we're not allowed to do that. Now we will go to Yeshayahu. So Yeshayahu has a different view in general of the role of Gentiles that is going to be in this new age, right? In kind of the age of the redemption. And we'll see that he actually doesn't talk about the idea of foreign marriage at all, but he does have a very different idea in terms of how we would work together. So let's take a look at that. There are several verses. Let's start actually with, we are reading it very briefly we're going to read from Yeshayahu Samech Yud Yud Aleph. That's Isaiah 60, 10 to 11. Let me get to the right place. And this is talking about the future. Uvanu bnei nechar chomotayich, umalchehem yishartunech, ki v'kitzbi hikitich, uvirtzoni richamtich. Foreigners will build your walls, and their kings will serve you, because in my anger I beat you down, but with my will, says God, I will have mercy on you. In other words, those people who brought your walls down, they will rebuild your walls, right? They will no longer be your enemies. Ufitchu sharach tamid yomam v'layla lo yisageru lavi elayich chel goyim umalchehem nehugim, right? And your gates will always be open day and night. Why? Because you don't have enemies anymore. Those people who were your enemies, they're building your walls. You will have no more enemies, so your gates can stay open day and night and bring in the wealth of nations and in a procession with their kings. So for all the nations will serve you. Now, in that's a standard kind of vision, right, of kind of the nations serving Israel, in other words, but at the same time, they're building the walls. If we compare it with Ezra, Daled, with Ezra, Daled, Ezra 4, if you recall, people wanted to build the temple with Israel, right? Right? The enemies of Judah and Benjamin, of Yehuda and Benjamin, heard that the returning exiles were building the temple, and they say, Vayomru lahem, I'm reading the next verse, Vayomru lahem, nivna imachem. Let's build with you. Because we also worship your God. And they're like, absolutely not. You are not building this temple with us. Now, this is a little bit different because we're talking about, in Yeshayahu, at this point, we're talking about the walls of the city, probably, as opposed to the walls of the temple. But it's still this idea that, yes, they will build. That is kind of what we want. That is what we're hoping for. Now, let me read some similar verses. I'm going on to Isaiah 61, Yeshayahu Samech Aleph. I'm reading from verse 5. And this also is giving them a job, right? So it's v'amdu zarim v'ra'utzonechem uvnei nechar ikarechem v'chormechem v'atem kohanei Adonai tikareu mishartei Eloheinu ye'amer lechem chel goyim telchelu v'chvodam tityamaru. In a similar way, the idea of you're working with the nations, but there's a very clear kind of hierarchy. The foreigners are your shepherds and your farmers and your and working in your vineyards, while you are the priests of God, because you're going to essentially be like a nation of priests, and that is going to be your role. Now, we have a very different attitude to what the role of Gentiles is going to be when we go to Yeshayahu Samach Vav, Isaiah 66. Before we said, okay, there's a hierarchy. They're doing their thing. They're building the walls, and this is a way that this is a good thing. Like, they destroy the walls, now they're building the walls. They're shepherds and farmers, and we're a nation of priests. Here we have something relatively shocking. Yeshayahu Samach Vav Chaf Aleph, that's 66:21. Actually, let's go back so that we have the context. I'm reading from 20 from Chaf. והביאו את כל אחיכם מכל הגויים מנחה לאדוני בסוסים וברכב ובצבים ובבדים ובכרכרות על הר קודשי ירושלים אמר אדוני כאשר יביאו בני ישראל את המנחה בכלי טהור בית אדוני. So all the nations are going to bring all of these offerings to Jerusalem, right? Just as Bnei Israel, just as Israelites bring the offering. וגם מהן אקח לכהנים ללוויים אמר אדוני. I will also take priests and Kohanim from them. So in other words, that's Kohanim and Leviim, like Levites and priests. Why? Because they're also bringing offerings. Just like you bring offerings, they'll bring offerings. And I will take priests and Levites from them as well. What does that even mean? We don't know. However, it's coupled with כי כאשר השמיים החדשים והארץ החדשה אשר אני עושה עומדים לפניי, נאום אדוני, כן יעמוד זרעכם ושמכם. Because just as the heavens and the new heavens and the new land that I create will be standing before me, so your children, your descendants, and your name will stand. In other words, what I will have the Gentiles do will not take away from your future Israel, from your name, from your descendants. This will only enhance your role, Israel. As opposed to what we saw, the concern of both Ezra and Nehemiah, that any sort of foreign marriage. Now, note, this is not talking about foreign marriage. It's talking, though, about how involved Gentiles will be in the service of God in Jerusalem and in the land of Israel. Now let's look at the classic passage that everyone always quotes when we talk about Second Isaiah. We're going to look at Yeshayahu Nun Vav. That's Isaiah 56. This is actually a beautiful passage in a lot of ways. And this passage is talking about you who want to serve God. And for some reason, there's something that would tell you that no, you don't have a future. And I'm telling you, you do. Let's look. כה אמר אדוני, שמרו משפט ועשו צדקה, כי קרובה ישועתי לבוא וצדקתי לגלות. So says God, keep the law and do justice, because my salvation is close, and my righteousness, or my justice, will be revealed. אשרי אנוש יעשה זאת ובן אדם יחזיק בה, שומר שבת מחללו ושומר ידו מעשות כל רע. So happy is the person who does this, and the person who holds it, who keeps Shabbat from being desecrated, and keeps his hand from doing evil. Ve'al yomar, so who is included in all these people who should be keeping Shabbat and not doing evil, and essentially serving God? Ve'al yomar ben hanechar hanilva el Adonai lemor, havdel yavdilani Adonai me'al amo, ve'al yomar hasaris hein ani etz yavesh. The foreigner who has joined God, should not say, God has separated me from his people. And the eunuch should not say, behold, I am a dry tree. Both of these people have a future. Ki כה אמר אדוני לסריסים אשר ישמרו את שבתותי, ובחרו באשר חפצתי, ומחזיקים בבריתי. Because so I say to the eunuchs who will keep my Shabbat, and have chosen what I desire, and who keep my covenant. ונתתי להם בביתי ובחומותי יד ושם. And I will give them in my home and in my walls a monument and a name. This is where we have the name Yad Vashem from. People who were wiped out and don't have children, they have a Yad Vashem in my walls. They have a name, a monument and a name. Tov mibanim umibanot, Shem olam eten lo asher lo yikare. Better than sons and daughters, a name, a eternal name I will give him that will not be cut off. That I say to the eunuch who says, I have no children, I have no future. And God says, no, in my house, in my walls, you will have a name forever. You will have a name and a monument forever. Uvnei hanechar, hanelvim al Adonai l'sharto, ula'ava et shem Adonai liot lo lavadim, kol shomer Shabbat mechalalo, umachazikim bivriti. And for the foreigners who have joined God to serve him, to love the name of God, and to be his servants, everyone who keeps Shabbat from desecration and holds fast to my covenant, v'havayotim el har kodshi, v'simachtim b'veit tfilati, olotohem v'zivchehem l'ratzon al mizbachi, ki beiti beit tfilah yikareh lechol ha'amim. I will bring them to my holy mountain. I will make them rejoice in my house of prayer, and their sacrifices will be accepted willingly on my altar, because my house will be called a house of prayer for all peoples. And that is astounding. It's joining with this idea of the Gentiles who bring sacrifices, and they will also be Levites and priests. This is a person who can somehow join the temple, like the eunuch, who again should not be able to join. He's got pieces of him are cut off. Like a priest who has a problem with a blemish, there are problems with a priest serving, right? But this eunuch where is his future? His future is in God, is in the house of God. And so is the future of this Gentile, the Gentile who says, I have been cut off. I have been cut off from the people of Israel. He says, no, you haven't. You have joined. You can keep my Shabbat. You can keep my covenant, and you can be part. You can rejoice in my house of prayer. Now, it's interesting here that we're talking prayer, but it also is talking about you can have sacrifices. You can be part of the worship of God. And so here we see, yes.
Since it mentions observing Shabbat, is
Yeah.
there an implication that they've converted, or are they non-Jews participating in the way that's described?
And I will tell you that at the very least, because there's already this idea that Shabbat is a special thing that was given to the Jewish people, right? You already have this idea. So the fact that you're saying to them, keep Shabbat, keep my law, keep my covenant, you absolutely could say that what you're talking about is someone who is either converting or what you would call like when we talk about B'nai Noach, maybe someone who's more like B'nai Noach, even though they're keeping Shabbat. And these days we say, no, you're not supposed to, like, if you're a Ben Noach, you don't keep Shabbat. But there is absolutely this idea that this person is making moves to join the Jewish people. It's not just that they say, oh, I also worship the same God, let me build with you. They are doing things that are also about, in a certain way, joining the Jewish people and within worship, right? So what we see here is, note that we're not talking about marriage at all. We're not talking about foreign wives at all. We are talking about Gentiles. Can Gentiles be part of the worship of God with the people of Israel? The answer is yes. Can they be part of all? And what's interesting in the last two pieces that we read, where I will also take from them Kohanim, priests and Levites, and they will join in, they will rejoice in my house of prayer. This idea that they can take full part in the holiness that God has given to his people. And again, without saying that there's going to be any sort of intermarriage, this person, what is interesting is he sees himself as a foreigner, and yet he says, oh, but I've been cut off from the people of Israel. Says, no, you absolutely can join in some way the worship that Israel has for its God. So I'm going to take a look because I see there's some comments. So Ammonite, Moabite, and Ashdodi, do we conclude that those who returned from Babylon had not married non-Jewish wives in Babylon? Do you think that the Jews in Babylon had prominent leaders and did a better job of observing the Torah, given the ignorance described when Ezra read the Torah? On the other hand, the criers probably included returnees from Babylon. Oh, okay, I do think that the way it's being described in terms of Nehemiah and then the idea that he came back and then he sees people have taken these foreign women, and the women that it's from Ammon, Moab, and Ashdod, it does sound like, yes, they married them locally. In other words, they didn't marry them in Babylon, they married them locally. And it's very possible that one of the things that's distressing him, and the fact that they can't speak Hebrew, is that somehow in Babylon they managed to still speak Hebrew, or whatever dialect they were speaking that they called Jewish, right? They were still speaking that in Babylon. They kept that up, and then they come back to the land of Israel, and there are these intermarried people where the kids can't speak it, right? So that must have been very, very distressing. It does seem to be saying that they married local women.
Miriam, Isaiah is
Yes.
very nice as a prophecy and as a goal to get to, but it seems like Ezra and Nehemiah are dealing with a hard reality, and that's a different picture than this beautiful messianic vision.
And I think that's well put and very
Mhm.
true. And I think that's why Ezra and Nehemiah are dealing with foreign wives. They're not so much talking about, oh, are people, going to join? Now, it does seem to be that and certainly in the beginning of Ezra, it seems that there are people who want to kind of hang on, kind of be part of the worship. Is that something that continues? It does seem, certainly in the later periods, there are absolutely Gentiles who are kind of connecting themselves to certain synagogues. We have from certain inscriptions, we know that Philo writes about this. There are Gentiles who are even before they're Christians, right? Or
Wait,
not related to
what year are you
Christianity.
talking about? What year are you talking
Oh, I'm
about?
talking about relatively late. I'm talking about
Okay.
pretty late. I'm talking about let's say hundreds of years, like much later, right? So
Mhm.
much later, we know that there are in fact Gentiles who are kind of connecting themselves to synagogues and to Jewish communities. It does seem from the way Yeshayahu is talking, from the way Isaiah is talking, that there are Gentiles who desire this. In other words, the same way he's talking about a eunuch says, oh, I won't have children, I'm going to be lost. And a Gentile says, oh, I've been cut off. This is something at least a little realistic, that there are Gentiles who apparently do want to kind of join in some way in this worship. But note that he's not dealing with the main social problem with that Ezra and Nehemiah are dealing with. They only pretty much talk about the foreign wives because that is a social issue. That's a social issue. That what do we do? What is the status of these women? What does it mean that they're marrying these women? And we could say, oh, but Yeshayahu is a prophet. Well, so is Malachi. Malachi is also a prophet, but he's also dealing with foreign wives and the pain of the first wives, right? So we can see that this is an actual social issue. The idea that people are marrying local women and the question of what needs to be done. And we can also see, and I didn't dwell on it too much when we were reading the passage in Nehemiah. Nehemiah says he did all these things. He cursed them, and he hit them, and he tore their hair out. It doesn't seem that Nehemiah was particularly successful. The fact is, he had to expel a priest, at least one priest, right? He expelled someone from the priesthood, and he went off on a suit with his wife, right? So again, if you say that Ezra is after Nehemiah, you're like, okay, well, apparently there was a shift where people were more willing to put aside their foreign wives later under Ezra. And again, that's if you say that Ezra was after Nehemiah. But it's certainly the way it's recounted. It doesn't sound like Nehemiah was super successful. Whereas with Ezra, it does sound like he was able to make everyone scared enough. Note the reason that they do it under Ezra, it sounds like, is because he managed to convince them that they are in danger of being destroyed if they don't clean up their act. So we see just how big an issue it is. Whereas on the other side, what Yeshayahu is talking about is this beautiful picture of the future where everyone can live in peace together, right? And that all the Gentiles really want is to serve God. All the Gentiles really want is to support Israel and serve God. And that's beautiful. And of course, that's going to be something that's a possibility. That's what Isaiah is talking about. So on that happy note,
Miriam?
thank you, everyone. Take care.
Thank you, Miriam.